Standards of that security clearance, are they strong enough? Why do we do certain things the way we do? We need answers, and we will find those answers.
Well, I just add that to what the Secretary said. In terms of what we changed after some of those earlier...
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I want to commend Senator Shaheen and Portman for their hard work in bringing a bipartisan bill to the floor that would boost energy efficiency in government, in industries, in commercial and residential buildings. This bill will help increase our economic competitiveness, enhance our national security, and combat global climate change. Energy efficiency improvements are a smart, cost-effective way to reduce pollution, increase the competitiveness of our manufacturers, and put people back to work in the building trades. We don't have an energy problem in this country. We have a waste problem. Last October, the Department of Energy and Lawrence Livermore and the National Labs calculated we waste 57% of all energy produced. 57%. We are becoming more energy efficient, but we have a long, long way to go, which is why Shaheen-Portman bill is so important. I would like to talk about two changes that I would like to see in the tax code that would help us achieve our goals of energy efficiency. I've worked on two bills in this regard, and I will be talking about them as we go through this session of Congress. I noted amendments, but as I think the presiding officer is well aware, to try to put a tax provision on a bill that originates in the Senate causes what's known as a blue slip when the bill is taken to the House, since all tax bills must originate in the House of Representatives. Therefore, I will be looking for opportunities to advance these two energy-related bills, but will not have the opportunity on the legislation that is before us. Energy efficiency is just as important as renewable nuclear or fossil fuels in all of the above strategy to meet the nation's energy demands. In fact, the cheapest, cleanest energy would have us is the energy we don't need because of efficiency improvements. Our tax code, in turn, can be an effective tool in promoting energy efficiency. Consider that buildings account for more than 40% of our energy consumption in the United States. So by encouraging businesses to make energy-efficient upgrades in their buildings, we can reap substantial energy savings. A recent study by McKinsey & Company backs me up. The study concluded that maximizing energy efficiency for homes and commercial buildings could help our country reduce energy consumption by 23% by 2020 and cut greenhouse gas emissions by 1.1 gigatons annually. This is equivalent to taking all passenger cars and light trucks off the road for a year. Making our buildings more efficient is more cost-effective than developing new energy sources. Current building codes are already making new construction significantly more efficient, but a boost is needed for older structures. Up to 80% of the buildings standing today will still be here in 2050, so encouraging the retrofitting of existing buildings needs to be a priority. Even buildings that are fairly new can benefit from retrofitting. For example, Busch Stadium, home of the St. Louis Cardinals, was built in 2006, but energy improvements in 2011 reduced energy consumption by 23%. We can see more successful projects like this proliferate across the nation, but our current tax policies have not yet proved to be meaningful incentives for making energy-efficient upgrades to existing buildings. For example, the landmark upgrade of the Empire State Building, which is under contract to lower energy consumption by almost 40%, could not qualify for a 179D deduction under the law's current structure. Senator Feinstein and I are working on legislation that would make common-sense reforms to the existing Section 179 tax deductions. Section 179 of the Internal Revenue Code provides a tax deduction that allows cost recovery of energy-efficient windows, roofs, lighting, and heating and cooling systems that meet certain energy-saving targets. Section 179D allows for an accelerated depreciation that encourages real estate owners to make the significant front-end investments in energy-efficient upgrades. The deduction is scheduled to expire at the end of this year. By extending, modifying, and simplifying this important provision, we can encourage energy saving, create thousands of retrofitting jobs in the construction industry, and reduce energy bills for all consumers, a win-win-win situation. Our legislation will make this critical incentive more accessible and effective for existing buildings that are currently using inefficient lighting systems, antiquated heating and cooling systems, and poor insulation. Upgrading and improving the 179 deduction will make thousands of businesses more competitive and create good-paying jobs right here in the United States. In addition to commercial properties, our building will also help promote energy efficiency in private residences. Homes consume more than 20% of our nation's energy, so we need to give American homeowners a helping hand to increase the energy efficiencies of their property. Our legislation does this by establishing a Section 25E tax credit for homeowners. Homeowners will receive a 30% tax credit of up to $5,000 for making an investment in energy efficiency and reducing energy consumption and costs. Simply put, it's an incentive that encourages homeowners to choose the most inexpensive option for saving energy. In a time of federal budget constraints, we must prioritize tax policies so they promote the most cost-effective methods of bolstering our energy security. Performance-based energy efficiency improvements can transform Americans' homes and lower energy bills for the families that live in them. Finally, our legislation targets the sector with the largest potential for increasing energy efficiency in our country, the industrial sector. Our bill offers focused, short-term incentives in 4 areas to help manufacturers make the efficiency investments necessary to innovate and compete. These critical areas include water reuse and replacing old chillers that harm the atmosphere. Madam President, I have a letter dated September 17, 2013 from a large coalition of business, labor, and environmental groups supporting the Cardin-Feinstein 179 approach to the reform of Section 179D. The Real Estate Roundtable spearheaded the letter, but 50 different organizations have signed on to it. I want to just quote one part of that letter. This is a quote from the letter that was sent in support of the legislation. The Section 179D deduction is a key incentive to leveraging significant amounts of private sector investment capital in buildings. It will help spur construction and manufacturing jobs through retrofits, save businesses billions of dollars in fuel bills as buildings become more efficient, place lower demands on the power grid, help move our country closer to energy independence, and reduce carbon emissions, end quote. Well, I think that's exactly what we should be doing. These are the type of incentives that we should be working for. And if you look at the groups that have signed on to this letter, these are groups who understand how to create jobs, and that Congress can help in that regard. Madam President, I would ask consent that a copy of that letter be printed in the record following my remarks.
Without objection.
Senator Crapo and I will be introducing legislation that will fix a problem that is keeping energy-efficient roof materials from being deployed. This is a separate bill that I think can help us, again, create jobs, save energy, and help our environment. The current tax code acts as an obstacle for retrofitting old roofs with energy-efficient ones because, generally speaking, commercial roofs are depreciated over 39 years. Our bill would shorten the depreciation schedule to 20 years for roofs that meet certain energy-efficient standards that are put in place over the next 2 years. By shortening the depreciation schedule, we are lowering the amount of tax that businesses would otherwise have to pay. They get the advantage of their savings in the early years. This change will create more jobs by encouraging the construction of new roofs and putting more cash into the hands of businesses. It's good tax policy because the average lifespan of a typical commercial roof is only 17 years. So this legislation corrects an inequity in the tax code by aligning the depreciation period closer to the lifespan of commercial roofs. Securing America's energy and economic future requires a renewed focus on energy efficiency. I hope we can pass the legislation that is before us and send it to the House. I hope the House will send us a tax bill that can serve as a basis for using the tax code to promote energy efficiency. Energy efficiency gains are a win-win for families, businesses, job seekers, taxpayers, and our human health and the environment. We can create jobs, we can help our economy, we can become more competitive, and we can have a cleaner environment if we do the right thing with the legislation before us and are able to improve our tax code to help achieve those goals. Madam President, I would suggest the absence of the quorum and yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander. The senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, 5 years ago, as a result of the greed and the recklessness and the illegal behavior on Wall Street, this country was plunged into the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And as a result of that, millions of people lost their homes, they lost their jobs, and they lost their life savings. And about 5 years ago, we were looking at a situation where some 700,000 Americans a month were losing their jobs, an unbelievable number. Stock market plummeted, panic in the financial sector. Now, the good news is that to a significant degree, we have stabilized that situation. We're not losing hundreds of thousands of jobs a month. Stock market is, in fact, doing very well. But what is important to understand is that it is imperative that we not accept the quote-unquote new normal for the economy as it is today. Because the reality is that today, while the situation is better than it was 5 years ago, for the middle class and for the working families of this country, the economy is still in very, very bad shape. And I'm not just talking about a 5-year period. I'm talking about a generational situation. Madam President, you may have seen that just yesterday, the Census Bureau came out with some new and extremely disturbing statistics. And it tells us why so many Americans are frustrated and angry with what's going on in Washington, and why so many people respond to pollsters and say, yes, we believe the country is going in the wrong direction. And what they're saying is true. They have every reason to be angry, every reason to be frustrated, and in fact, economically, this country is moving in a very significant way in the wrong direction. This is what the Census Bureau reported yesterday. They said that the typical middle-class family, that family right in the middle of American society, that median family income today is less than it was 24 years ago. Median family income today for that typical American family is less than it was 24 years ago. In 2012, typical middle-class families, that family right in the middle, made $51,017. Back in 1989, that family made $51,681. What does that mean? It means that 24 years later, after all of the effort and the hard work of people, today they are worse off than they were 24 years ago. Let's think about what that means. It means that despite the explosion of technology and all of the robotics and all of the cell phones and everything else that has made this economy more productive, the the median family income today is worse than it was 24 years ago. Now, I'll just give you an example of what that means. If, Madam President, during that period from 1989 through 2012, that typical American family had received just a 2% increase in their income, just 2%, a very modest increase. That family today, instead of making $51,000 a year, would be making $81,000 a year, $30,000 gap. So if over that 24-year period, people had seen a modest, I'm not talking about a huge increase, a modest increase in their income of 2%, which people certainly deserve, that family would make $81,000 a year. Today that family is making $51,000 a year, less than that family was making 24 years ago. And this is what the Census Bureau also reported. They said that the typical middle-class family has seen its income go down by more than $5,000 since 1999 after adjusting for inflation. $5,000. They told us that the average male worker made $283 less last year than that same worker made 44 years ago. So you want to know why people are angry? They see an explosion of technology, they see an explosion of productivity, and yet a male worker today is making less than a male worker, an average male worker made 44 years ago. Average female workers earn $1,775 less than they did in 2007. A record-breaking 46.5 million Americans lived in poverty last year. That is more people living in poverty than at any time in American history. Mr. President, 16 million children live in poverty. That's almost 22% of all kids in America. That is the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. That is the future of America, and over 1 out of 5 kids in this country are living in poverty. Mr. President, a higher percentage of African Americans lived in poverty last year than was the case 15 years ago. 9.1% of seniors lived in poverty last year, higher than in 2009. More American seniors were living in poverty last year than in 1972. Today, 48 million Americans are uninsured, no health insurance. That will change as a result of Obamacare, but as of today, 48 million Americans are uninsured, 3 million more than in 2008. So, Mr. President, when people call your office in Delaware or my office in Vermont, and they say, you know what, we are hurting, they are telling the truth. What they are saying is Congress seems to deal with everything except the reality facing the middle class and working families of this country. And people worry desperately not only for themselves, they worry more for their kids. What kind of education will their kids have? Will there be enough teachers in the classroom? Will their kids be able to afford to go to college? Will young working families be able to find quality, affordable child care? What kind of jobs will their kids have when they get out of high school or they get out of college? Those are the questions that tens of millions of Americans are asking all over this country, and here in Washington, we are not giving them clear and straightforward answers. Now, Mr. President, what makes this moment in American history unique is that while the great American middle class is disappearing, and while the number of Americans living in poverty is at an all-time high, something else is going on in this society. And that is that the people on top, the top 1%, have never, ever had it so good. Now, last week we learned an astounding fact. I want everybody to hear this clearly. And that is between 2009 and 2012, the last years we have information, 95% of all new income created in this country went to the top 1%. 95% of all of the new income created in America went to the top 1%, and the bottom 99% shared in 4% of the new income. So what we are seeing as a nation is the disappearance of the middle class, millions of families leaving the middle class into poverty, struggling desperately to feed their families, to put gas in their car to get to work, to survive on an $8 an hour wage. You got that reality over there, and then you got another reality, is that the people on top are doing better than at any time since before the Great Depression. Today, Mr. President, the top 1% owns 38% of the nation's financial wealth. Meanwhile, the bottom 60%, the majority of the American people together, own only 2.3% of the wealth in this country. We used to, when I was in school, and I'm sure all over this country, kids studied what we called oligarchy. And an oligarchy is a nation in which a handful of very wealthy people control the economy, control the politics of the nation, and it doesn't really matter about political parties because they own those parties as well. Well, guess what? What we used to look at Latin America and laugh about or worry about has now come home to this country. Today in America, we have the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth, and that gap between the very, very rich and everybody else is growing wider. Now, I don't believe that the American people feel that what this great country should be about is that the top 1% own 38% of the wealth, while the bottom 60% own barely 2% of the wealth. That is not the dream of what this great country was about. Mr. President, earlier this week, Forbes magazine reported that the wealthiest 400 Americans in this country, 400 people, are now worth a record-breaking $2 trillion. 400 people worth $2 trillion. In other words, the concentration of wealth is getting greater and greater and greater. The wealthiest 400 Americans now own more wealth than the bottom half of Americans, over 150 million Americans. We could probably squeeze 400 people into this room. And if we did, and they were the wealthiest people in this country, 400 people in this room would own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the American people. Just one family in America, the Walton family, the owners of Walmart, are worth over $100 billion and own more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. One family owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of Americans. Mr. President, while the middle class disappears, while children in this country go hungry, while veterans sleep out on the street, corporate profits are now at an all-time high, while wages as a share of the economy are at a record low. Wall Street, the major financial institutions in this country, whose greed and recklessness drove us into this economic downturn, and the group of people that the American middle class bailed out 5 years ago, they are now doing phenomenally well. So Wall Street drives the country into a severe economic downturn. Wall Street is bailed out by the American middle class. Wall Street now is doing phenomenally well while the middle class is disappearing. And you want to know why the American people are angry and disgusted and frustrated? That's why. In fact, Mr. President, the CEOs on Wall Street, the executives there, are on track to make more money this year than they did in 2009. That is the time in which Wall Street greed destroyed our economy. The American middle class is disappearing. Poverty is increasing. The gap between the rich and everyone else is growing wider and wider. That is the economic reality facing this country, and the time is long overdue for this Congress and this President to start in a very forceful, aggressive way to address that issue. But where are we today? Are we having a major debate on the floor of the Senate as to how we're going to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure and create millions of jobs? I don't hear that debate. Are we having a debate on the floor of the Senate that says it is an outrage that working people throughout the country are trying to survive on a minimum wage of $7.25, and we've got to raise that substantially so that when people work 40 hours a week, they can actually take care of themselves and their families and not go deeper into debt? Are we having that debate? I don't hear that. Are we having a debate which says that not only should we not be cutting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, but we should join the rest of the industrialized world and guarantee health care to all of our people as a right and citizenship? I don't hear that debate. Quite the contrary, Mr. President. Here's the debate that I hear. This is what I'm hearing from my colleagues over in the House and the Republican leadership over there. What I'm hearing them saying is that while poverty is at an all-time high, while our child care system and early childhood education is a disaster, what they want to do is continue sequestration and push for more across-the-board spending cuts to Head Start, while elderly people throughout this country who are fragile and hurting are dependent on the Meals on Wheels program. They want to continue cuts in that program. While millions of families are wondering how they're going to send their kids to college, they want to continue sequestration, make it harder for working families to send their kids to college, want to continue cuts in unemployment insurance and a number of other vital programs. So in other words, instead of addressing the very serious problems facing the middle class and the working class of this country, what I'm hearing from my Republican colleagues is let's make a bad situation even worse. Mr. President, let me just conclude by saying this. Instead of cutting the Head Start program, we should be expanding the Head Start program. Study after study makes it clear that the most important years of a human being's life are 0 to 3. Give those little kids the intellectual and emotional nourishment that they need so that they will do well in school is perhaps the most important thing that we can do. We have got to increase funding for Head Start, not cut funding for Head Start. Mr. President, It is a moral outrage in this country that anybody here talks about cutting back on the Meals on Wheels program, which provide at least one nutritious meal a day to fragile and vulnerable senior citizens. We should not be cutting back on that program. We should be significantly expanding that program. Mr. President, I can tell you that in Vermont, if you talk to the people in my state, they will tell you that we have significant problems with our bridges, significant problems with our roads, significant problems with rail, significant problems with wastewater and water plants. People want to invest in our crumbling infrastructure, make us a more productive nation, and when you do that, we can create jobs. Right now on the floor, I don't know if we're going to get to vote on it, there is a very modest bill brought forth by Senators Shaheen and Portman, which talk about energy efficiency in Vermont throughout this country. People are paying higher fuel bills than they should, wasting enormous amounts of energy, contributing to global warming through greenhouse gas emissions because we are not aggressive on energy efficiency, making our homes more efficient. We should be investing in energy efficiency and create jobs doing that. So, Mr. President, the bottom line is we are in a pivotal moment in American history. Rich are getting richer, middle class is disappearing, poverty is at an all-time high, people demanding that we create jobs, address the problems facing this country. And yet we have folks who want to make a bad situation worse by protecting the tax breaks that have been given to the wealthy and large corporations, and then they want to cut back on the needs of ordinary Americans. So I hope, Mr. President, that the American people will stand up, they will say is enough, and that they will demand that finally the United States Congress stands with the middle class of this country. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Senator Sanders was talking about the economy. Federal Reserve Board Chairman Ben Bernanke is holding a news conference on the economy shortly. The briefing happens quarterly after the Fed's Open Market Committee meeting, where they talk about monetary policy and what to do about interest rates. That'll be live on C-SPAN 3 starting at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time.
Mr. President, I would ask suspension of the quorum call.
The Senator from Michigan, without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to talk about the relentless assault on the poor and hungry in this country that's being waged right now in the House of Representatives and too often here on the Senate floor. The meltdown on Wall Street caused a recession in this country, as we know, that was worse than anything we've experienced since the Great Depression. 8 million people, 8 million Americans lost their jobs. Trillions of dollars in the stock market were wiped out. And with that money went the life savings of many middle-class families. Many families lost their homes. Small businesses closed up shop. This was an economic disaster that hit communities across this country as hard as any natural disaster that we have seen. And while Wall Street is doing well again these days, millions of families on Main Street are still waiting for their situation to improve. We are seeing new job creation, but millions of Americans are still out of work. And in fact, when we look at the chart on employment rates, we see what happened in 2008 and 2009, the numbers of people who lost their jobs. And while based on the population, we're holding our own, we're just barely at this point keeping up with the population and beginning to grow again. Now, what the House Republicans are saying is this: get a good-paying job, or your family will just have to go hungry. But there aren't enough good-paying jobs, as we all know. And to add insult to injury, they're slashing job training money, which makes absolutely no sense. Job training money that states get to help Americans find work. Economists point also to the irresponsible sequestration cuts as a cause of the sluggish job growth. In the Senate, we've passed a budget that will replace the sequester with a balanced solution to reduce the debt and balance the budget. But a handful of senators on the other side of the aisle are blocking us from even being able to send negotiators to the House to finalize the budget. And so we're now stuck with a policy that makes absolutely no sense, that economists say is slowing down our economy and costing us jobs because of political games, pure and simple, in Washington. And this is having a very serious effect on the wallets of Americans who continue to find it difficult to put food on the table for their families. This is very real. It's not a political game for American families all across the country, and certainly in my great state of Michigan. Even those people who are able to find work are working for less, and in fact, wages as a percent of the economy are at 30-year lows. So when we look at what's happened, it's not only job growth not coming back as fast as it should. We're seeing people who have been in the middle class struggling by their fingertips, trying to hold on, or most of the time, much of the time, losing ground, because we are seeing wages going down and down and down, even for the jobs that are available. This is the situation that millions of American families find themselves in today. They're struggling to find work, and when they do find work, the salary isn't even close to what it was before the recession. Many people have taken pay cuts to keep their jobs, or they've had their pay and benefits frozen for 4 or 5 years. Families that just 10 years ago were doing fine are now in dire straits. And now, the same Republicans who refuse to fix the sequester, who refuse to work with us to get the economy moving again for millions of middle-class families, again, they're trying to take temporary food assistance away from the children and the families who are out of work or who are working 1, 2, 3 part-time jobs, trying to just make ends meet. And let me stress, as we debate the question of hunger and food assistance in America, we know that many families receiving SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, are working. They're working. We are looking now at about half of those in families receiving food help are working. There are people with children whose wages are falling behind, so they're no longer to be able to feed their families. For those who have lost their jobs, SNAP is a short-term lifeline to keep food on the table while they search for a job. We know that the average new SNAP recipient only receives help for 10 months or less. Let me repeat that. The person that's coming on during this recession worked before they needed help. They're getting an average 10 months worth of help so their family doesn't starve while they're looking for work and trying to put the pieces back together. And then after that, they're going back to work. Here's what we also know, Mr. President. We know that men and women, families on supplemental nutrition assistance are using that money to feed their children. Nearly half of the people who are getting food assistance help are children in this country. Children. We are looking now at nearly half being children, children who are going to bed hungry at night while their parents are doing the best they can to get back on their feet. We see senior citizens who find themselves in a situation where their only income is Social Security. And that little bit of food help makes a difference between whether or not they can go to the grocery store and put food in the cupboard or not. The real faces of food assistance are veterans who went to war for this country, many of whom were injured and returned home with only to find that they can't find a job or their disabilities make it impossible to work. People with disabilities are the faces of food assistance. And instead of honoring these men and women for their service, House Republicans want to take away the little bit of help they get each month to help buy food. If you add all of this up, Mr. President, 85% of the faces of food assistance, of the SNAP program, are children with their parents, people with disabilities, including our veterans, and senior citizens, 85%. The bill being considered in the House of Representatives would kick millions of children and their families off of food assistance. That's how Majority Leader Eric Cantor and House Republicans will cut $40 billion in food assistance, and that's what they will be voting on probably tomorrow. They do it by cutting off individuals and families who need the assistance the most. Under the Republican plan, which Eric Cantor says encourages people to get back to work, benefits for a jobless adult without children would be limited to 3 months every 3 years. You better eat a lot during those 3 months. That means if you lose your job and are unemployed for 6 months, half of the time you'll be able to have help in order to be able to put food on your table. And once you find a new job, you better make sure your company doesn't close, doesn't go overseas within the next 2.5 years, or you won't be able to have any help to put food on the table as well. Mr. President, it's important to note that the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has said that 14 million people will stop receiving food assistance over the next 10 years the right way. As the economy improves, they will get back on their feet financially and be able to find a good paying job. 14 million people. We build into our farm bill reduced costs in SNAP because the economy is beginning to improve. But the House of Representatives, the House Republican Majority Leader's bill, eliminates families from food assistance the wrong way by eliminating food help to those who most need it. 1.7 million poor, unemployed adults next year whose average income is about $2,500 a year. A year. $2,500 a year. Those are the folks that would lose help with food. 2.1 million low-income working families and seniors next year alone. And 210,000 children would receive cuts, would lose their school lunches under the House Republican plan. And other unemployed parents and their children, parents who want to work but can't find a job or a training program to join, will be eliminated from help. The Republicans say it's about getting people back to work. But this bill cuts worker training and job placement for people who are trying to get back to work, who are mortified that probably for the first time in their lives they've needed help with food. They're people who've paid taxes their whole lives, got caught in this great recession, are trying to climb out, but need a little help for one of the things I think we would all consider pretty basic, which is the ability to eat and to provide food for their families. Mr. President, people on SNAP want to work. They're like any American, wanting to work, but there just aren't currently enough jobs, which is why we should be focusing on jobs and growing the economy. Right now, we have 3 unemployed workers for every job opening. It's better. I can remember standing on the floor a few years ago saying the number was 6 unemployed workers for every job, and then 5, and now it's 3, but it is still 3 for every job opening. So does the Republican plan do anything to help people find jobs or the job training skills they need to get a good paying job so they can care for their families? No, absolutely not. In fact, the Republican plan would offer cash-strapped states a truly perverse incentive. I had to read this several times to be able to see whether or not this was actually written down this way. They are allowing states to keep half of the federal money that would be spent on food whenever they cut somebody off the program. So the incentive is to eliminate help for people so the state can keep half the money and use it for something else. That's in the House bill. Let me be clear. We have seen occasions of fraud and abuse in the food assistance program, and that's why the Senate Farm Bill includes major reforms to crack down on misuse, to make sure only people who truly need help are getting help. We heard reports of people winning the lottery, 2 in my home state, and still getting SNAP benefits. That will not happen again under our bill. We've seen liquor stores accepting food stamps when they don't really sell much food. We've reformed that to make sure that cannot happen again, as well as a number of other areas where we can bring more accountability and tighten up the program. We want every dollar to go to the people that I'm talking about today, who worked hard all their lives, found themselves in a bad situation, they're trying to climb out, and they just need a little bit of help because their children are hungry, because they're hungry. Or maybe they're a veteran, or maybe they're a senior, or maybe they're somebody with a disability who just needs a little bit of help. So we have passed real reforms to crack down on abuses that we have found. And we did it in a bipartisan way in the Senate, and I'm very proud of that. But what the House Republicans are voting on is nothing more than extremely divisive, extremely partisan political exercise that is, by the way, going nowhere. And it's jeopardizing the passage of a 5-year farm bill. Mr. President, we have never seen this kind of partisanship injected into agricultural policy, food and policy in our country before. It is shocking what has happened in the last 2 years in the House of Representatives. And shame on the majority floor leader and his allies for doing it now. Our farmers, our ranchers, our small towns and rural communities, and our children and families do not deserve this. The 16 million people who work in this country because of agriculture do not deserve this. What is happening this week in the House of Representatives is not about reality. It's about some fiction they've made up. An idea that if the stock market is doing well, if wealthy members of Congress and others are doing well, then surely everyone in America must be doing well too. And anyone who isn't just must be lazy or not trying hard enough. The reality is that most people in America are still struggling to get back on their feet from the recession. There still aren't enough jobs for every person who needs and wants one. The jobs that are there pay less than they did 5 years ago. And families getting food help are making about $500 a week. They don't have money in the stock market. They don't have investment income. In fact, the average SNAP family doesn't have more than $300 in assets, things that they own. What they do have, though, because of our policy of supporting those families, is $4.53 a day to eat. $4.53 a day to eat. Less than one specialty coffee at our favorite stores. And some members of the House of Representatives have decided this is too much. $4.53 a day is too much for our disabled veterans. It's too much for our senior citizens living on Social Security. It's too much for our children, for families working multiple part-time jobs and trying to figure out how to get out of the hole that was created, not by them, but by others in the Great Recession. Mr. President, we all want to spend less on food assistance. And the good news is that under the Senate Farm Bill we all voted on, we do spend less. The baseline for food assistance is going down. Why? Because the economy is improving. $11.5 billion in reduced spending is built into our Farm Bill because people are finding jobs. And that's added to the $4 billion in fraud and misuse that we have included. Again, the Congressional Budget Office projects that 14 million people will leave the Supplemental Nutrition Program as the economy improves because they will no longer need temporary help. Costs are going down the right way because the economy is beginning to improve, and as it improves more aggressively, which is what we should be working on together, we will see those costs go down. And we should also add that SNAP recipients are already going to see an arbitrary cut, unfortunately, to their benefits on November 1 because of the expiration of the Recovery Act help that temporarily boosted assistance to families in need that we did in 2009. So they're already going to see less available for food. If we want to continue to cut spending the right way, we should be working together to invest in our economy, to support our businesses, large and small, to out-innovate the global competition, to get rid of the sequester, and to help people get the training they need to find good-paying jobs. You know, Mr. President, the Republican approach is like saying, you know, we are so tired of spending money on wildfires, forest fires, so we'll just cut the budget for the fire service. This isn't going to work. The fires will rage on, and it's only going to get worse. If we want fewer fires, we've got to find ways to prevent fires and contain the fires in order to reduce the costs. The Republican approach is also like saying, we're tired of paying for the cost of drought, flooding, other crop disasters, so we're going to cut crop insurance. The government's cost of crop insurance went up over $5 billion, 50% last year because of droughts and flooding and so on, 50%. And while we're seeing increases in crop insurance, it's projected that food assistance is actually going down over the next 10 years of $11.5 billion. Are the House Republicans proposing we eliminate help for farmers in a disaster? Or just low-income families, children, seniors, disabled veterans when they have a disaster? What's happening in the House right now is a complete reversal of 50 years of great American values. Today in the United States of America, 1 in 6 people say they don't know where their next meal will come from. 1 in 6 Americans. In the greatest, the wealthiest country in the world. We have a long history in this country of making sure that poverty and hunger are kept in check. And in fact, presidents of both sides have understood this. President Ronald Reagan said, as long as there is one person in this country who's hungry, that's one person too many. It's one person too many. I wish our House Republicans could hear that and understand what he was saying. What would he have to say about this effort now in the House of Representatives to blame the victims of poverty and unemployment, to blame the children, to blame the seniors, to blame the veterans who only want enough food to be able to eat, and for those who are able to work to get back on their feet and get a job? The House Republicans who are proposing these drastic cuts all have enough to eat. We in the Senate are not living on $4.53 a day for food. We have enough to eat. None of us wonder where our next meal is going to come from, like 1 out of 6 Americans. None of us have to worry about whether or not our children will go to bed hungry tonight. None of us have to skip meals so our children don't have to. We in America are better than the debate that is being waged in the United States House of Representatives. And the good news for children, families, seniors, the disabled, and veterans across America is that the House bill will never see the light of day in the United States Senate. It's time to stop the political games around hunger in America. It's time to work together to pass a 5-year farm and food bill to grow the economy and reduce the need for food assistance the right way by making sure every American has the ability to have a good paying job so they can feed their families and achieve their part of the American dream. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I wonder if I